Hey there guys, it's Metro, and today we're back doing another tier list for Mythic Plus dungeons in Legion, the second installment here, now ranking all damage dealers within. Before we even begin, I would like to remind you that this tier list is based entirely on my opinions, which yours may differ from. They are based on my experience and also consulting with others playing the specs. The classes are listed in this tier list instead of actual specs, with one exception, that being Druid. And the list is done in a way to not include any tanks or healers into the discussion as well. A lot of people didn't understand that last time. We're doing it in a vacuum, so we're only considering the DPS where relevant. Sometimes I bring up the possibility of a tank or two, but 99% of the time it's completely not even considered. A lot of the ranking is also based on unique ability brought to the dungeon. A lot of people didn't understand that in the previous one as well. But this time I did consider damage a lot more heavily, as the higher we do Mythic Pluses, damage does become a much larger factor. So if you hear something you disagree with in the video, please remember that once again, my opinions are all that matters in my list, and it's based a lot on utility and things that each class has specifically. I'd love to hear your discussions, but either way, let's get right into it. Tier 1, number one overall, and remaining number 1 from the previous list is Death Knight. Frost has become an incredibly strong damage dealer, but Unholy has received recent buffs. I would still prefer Frost, and that's what we'll consider going forward. Frost has incredibly consistent AoE potential and has CDs that line up perfectly for 5-man trashes like Syndragos' Fury and Pillar of Frost. They also have key utility, which you know I favor, in Death Grip and Battle Res. Unholy 2 can have a second grip, which can be even better. I also value Death Grip as the single best utility in the game for 5-mans, and I'll tell you why. Positioning of the Death Grip is very likely equal to a massive DPS increase, and as you know, there are many dungeons with mobs that try to avoid you. It's a pain in the ass really, but in so many dungeons where mobs try to avoid being meleeed by you or move out of melee range, the only way to increase your DPS on them when you're AoEing is to bring them back into the fold. They're also incredibly durable, but do have below average mobility, which I think is made up for by having a Death Grip. Number 2 overall is Havoc Demon Hunter. There is no question that the Havoc Demon Hunter is one of the strongest damage dealers in the entire video game right now, but especially will remain so on targets with multiple mobs. They have an incredible burst potential on both bosses and AoE, which makes them ideal for 5-mans, and they simply have some of the highest numbers in the entire game in these exact situations. You'd be hard-pressed to match a Havoc Demon Hunter, even as the other classes we're going to discuss. They also are a very mobile melee, which if you watched my original tier list, you know I value highly for melee. It's not often that I consider melee to be extremely good compared to a range, but when they have the mobility of the ones in the top few tiers, then it is easy to overlook that. And they also do have one good piece of utility, and that is their stun. A stun is, in my opinion, the second most valuable utility in the game, and between Battle Res, Death Grip, and Stun, all of the best classes that you're going to want for 5-mans will include at least one of these. Number 3 overall sees Mage jump many places from the previous list, and I'm going to take a moment to explain why. The previous list did not give credit to their absolute insane damage potential, and honestly, I did not ever consider damage to ever be as important as it was back then, but now there is absolutely no question that damage is one of the most important things that can be done, especially on AoE and certain affixes. So I will give credit where credit is due. Fire Mage should be number 3 100% on this list, if not even higher, I'm sure some will say. I am excluding the other 2 specs, Frost and Arcane, because I believe Fire is the only option as a mage in dungeons. I know you can obviously do dungeons as the other spec, but I frankly feel Fire is objectively better than them. They have incredibly strong cleave potential, long story short. They also have good, strong burst AoE and single target, but these things all get better and better as we continue to get gear, and that is an incredible thing. They're also quite durable in terms of range damage dealers with Ice Block and Blink, but not the strongest. It's very rare that Ice Block is what you need in terms of durability, and they do have very limited utility. The only utility they actually have is Bloodlust. Greater Invis can be used in some situations, but it's very rare. They're basically number 3 overall simply because of their immense cleave and burst potential, and having a third on the top 3 without a Bloodlust would be a bit silly, because the way I'm thinking about these things include these 3 as the 3 damage dealers in the 5-man. So we have Death Knight with Battle Res and Death Grip on top of incredible damage, Havoc with a stun on top of incredible damage, and Fire Mage with incredible damage and Bloodlust. So it's really the perfect group comp. But anyway, that's tier 1. Let's move on. Tier 2, number 1. Number 4 overall is Hunter. Hunter is a class that I have favored significantly over the last few expansions of progressive 5-mans, and it's easy to see why. Currently, all 3 of their specs have a definite spot in 5-mans, but if you ask me, I would prefer ranged, and if you really ask me, I would prefer beast mastery. However, Marks is likely the best damage right now. BM does bring incredible utility that would be difficult for Marks to bring, including Bloodlust and B-Res Pep, but they aren't necessarily needed if you have some of the other spots that we talked about in the 5-man. Either way, all 3 have incredible burst potential, and this is something that is somewhat rare on ranged damage dealers. They do have a varying gambit of utility that differs greatly with all 3 specs. If you're the only Bloodlust in your group, I would say you better be ready to use it regardless. And Misdirect is still very useful after all these years, especially in Skittish, and they could feign death as well. They're also the most mobile and durable of all ranged damage dealers, and that can be incredibly useful in a lot of affixes and difficulties as well. And also, as an aside, I wanted to talk about set bonuses more in these dungeon videos, but unfortunately it just seems like it's not very applicable for actual damage dealers. It will be more so for tanks and healers, but I find the set bonuses can be particularly strong in 5-mans, especially the BM one here for hunters. Tier 2, number 2, number 5 overall is Windy Walker Jr. They still continue to have some of the best exponential DPS in the video game. What I mean by that is the more mobs you're encountering, the more damage they will do exponentially, especially compared to anything below this point in the list. On top of amazing burst AoE damage, they have incredible mobility and very strong durability as well. And they have the tried and tested no cast AoE stun in leg sweep. They're a very basic kit if you ask me, looking at it plainly, but when you want very good AoE damage and very good utility, I would say Windwalker is middle of the tier list for a very good reason. As a footnote, I'd like to discuss the Windwalking passive and the legendary that synergizes with it. The ring March of the Legion increases Windwalk to 25% speed for allies within 10 yards and 10 seconds after they leave the 10 yards, and this can easily be one of the strongest things any dungeon group can contain. It's quite rare to actually have a Windwalker and have one with the ring as well who wants to use it, because it's definitely not a DPS increase for them, but for the entire group it can be crazy good. Typically I wouldn't consider legendaries in the discussion at all, and frankly I didn't when I placed them here. Otherwise, if I did, they may be number 1 overall, but at this point a lot of people should have many different legendaries, so it shouldn't be as hard to find one Windwalker with the ring as well. Tier 2, number 3, number 6 overall is Warlock. Now if you've rated it all this tier in Nighthold, you know that Warlock has some incredible upsides, especially when compared with tier set bonuses and trinkets, and these things directly correlate to 5-man progression as well. I find all specs shining right now, but I would much prefer Affliction and then Demo and then Destro. Either way, lots of talents and playstyle variance between all 3 of these specs, and that could make a higher skill cap needed than other classes, but that can be very rewarding. For example, if you're able to play Affliction and Demo properly, there may be a situation in one dungeon where Demo's better, maybe a situation in another dungeon where Affliction is better. They also have incredible durability, but below average mobility, which can really hurt them in 5-mans, and they have Soulstone. Now typically I would consider this a battle res, as it does function as one, but recently I have found great use for its traditional purpose, all the way back from like Classic and stuff. When you place it on someone before pulling, and then if they die, they immediately res. It's been pretty good for group comps that have 2 battle reses. We'll put the Soulstone on, say, the tank, or maybe even the healer if you know there's going to be an issue, and then if they die, they can just res immediately. There's no resource cost at all for the Warlock, and it's not a big pain to do it in combat. And this can also be used for trash skipping, like we're going to talk about with Shaman, but unfortunately this has become increasingly out of favor since the challenge mode mentality has waned. Tier 3 incoming, but before we do, I just want to give a brief disclaimer reminding people that just because your favorite spec is on the second half of the list does not mean that I think it is unplayable in dungeons. Really, we are blessed with the greatest amount of balance we have ever had in the World of Warcraft video game, and that should be very evident as I list these next ones, especially in tier 3. Many of these classes are easily just as strong as anything else, but we're just making a list and you have to go 1 through 9 or 10 or whatever we have on this list in order to actually make the list. So let's get to it. Tier 3, number 1 is Warrior. Warrior, especially Fury, has some of the best DPS output period in 5-mans. That's not necessarily the only thing I like about Warrior, but it is definitely one of the things to consider. If you're bringing a Warrior to a 5-man, they are probably going to be doing, on average, a little bit more damage than most of the other classes out there right now. They do, unfortunately, suffer from average mobility and durability. It's not bad, but it's definitely not as good as other classes, and there doesn't seem to be a discernible niche. They do, however, have a very good utility. Having Shockwave on such a short CD can be extremely good, but almost every warrior I pug with never takes it, and I just don't understand why. It's obviously a bad sample size to say that most warriors wouldn't take Shockwave. Anybody with a brain hopefully understands that even though Shockwave may not be the best damage talent on the tier, it is incredibly important for dungeons, but it seems to be a hard thing to get people to wrap their heads around. They also have Commanding Shout, which in raids can be one of the most effective CDs in the video game, especially coming from a damage dealer, but once again, it is difficult to get people to freaking use it in dungeons. So many warriors seem to want to sit on this CD, and even in raids this happens to us as well. These warriors react to the damage instead of anticipate it, and it's hard to blame them. They're doing damage, they're not actually trying to keep people alive. But if they actually focused on it, they would realize that this ability will absolutely save wipes, especially in a 5-man. Number 8 overall, tier 3. Number 2 is Bombkin. A very interesting spec for 5-mans this expansion, usually not one I favor, but has a very interesting little thing going on with it right now. Their actual damage isn't bad at all. They have great spread AoE, and like you're going to see with Shadow Priest, this continues to be more viable as we do harder and harder dungeons, especially trash. That type of damage can be very, very useful when mobs stay alive very long. They also have pretty good survivability and mobility, but it does require a lot more effort than any other class and spec out there. And they have some of the coolest utility in the game. Not necessarily always the best, but an incredible, incredible kit. They have strong conventional utility in battle res, still very, very useful for any type of 5-man. And then they have really unconventional, but still really strong utility. Let's list them. Rapid Innervation, which is an artifact trait for the Innervation spell, is a huge, huge, huge DPS increase for healers. Absolutely insane. Whenever I get this on my Holy Paladin or Disc Priest, I am in heaven. And it is so nice. It's only a 3-minute CD, and it's such a DPS increase for these classes. They also have Force of Nature, which is their first tier talent, aka many people call it Trents. It's a low CD, I think it's 1 minute, effectively a tank CD, and there's no other talent or ability in the video game that works this way. It can be incredibly useful with some affixes, but overall allows the tank to pull larger pulls with less worry about his own survival. It basically taunts mobs constantly. So on any type of affix where that is a valuable thing to have, Bombkin is going to be very, very, very good. Then of course they still have Solar Beam, which remains a bit weird still in the world of interrupts. It's a 1 minute AoE silence, but this can be incredibly valuable in dungeons with large packs of casters, especially the imps in Court of Stars. It can be even stronger if you have a Death Knight or Demon Hunter tank, as they can arrange the mobs with their movement abilities like Gorfine's Grasp and pull them into the silence. And then they still do have Typhoon, which, as we talked about in the past, has very niche usage, but it can still be pretty useful. If you use it right, it can be very interesting as well. A lot of people don't know this, but the pelters in Neltharion's Lair, for example, any mob that would do this, it will work for. But any mob that will try to disengage from you, if you use it away from them at the exact second, they just fall right to the ground. They don't complete their jump. So a good Bombkin can be easily one of the best damage dealers utility-wise for a 5-man. Number 9 overall is Shadow. They've moved up significantly in my thought process, and I do give them a lot more credit than I originally had. Especially now that we're doing harder dungeons with harder trash consistently, their overall kit seems to have been rebalanced to be a lot stronger for 5-mans. It does still require a lot of ramp-up time, but as there is more ramp-up time available in 5-mans, they become stronger just passively. They have good overall damage, especially on bosses as well. Nothing outstanding compared to how they used to be in raids, but they can still be very valuable regardless. They're also extremely durable, but very, very immobile. They have decent utility as well. A stun that can be hard to use properly, but is still an AoE stun, and Mass Dispel with limited usage. See, rarely a DPS increase for the group is Mass Dispel. A lot of people commented on this in the previous video as well, but what you're not realizing is that Mass Dispel is typically dispelling things that the healer can just get to on his own pace. There's very little reason for a Shadow Priest to spend the global on it. If you guys can think of any specific ones, I'd love to continue this discussion. We talked about it in the last tier list as well, but it seems like nobody ever has a really, really slam dunk case for Mass Dispel. I think the best one was the Court of Stars boss. I think the first boss that he puts the magic debuff on you that if you don't jump, it stays on you forever, and you can just dispel it all off. But once again, jumping is not necessarily a DPS loss unless you're a caster, so it was a very niche thing. In the past, Mass Dispel had a very, very definite application, but it just seems like in the new dungeons, this just doesn't exist anymore. Tier 4, number 1 is Rogue. Frankly, I need to let you know that I don't think I've played with with a single rogue in a 5-man or a raid for months. We have 0 in the guild, and I've never pugged with one in many, many months. So to me, they seem out of favor, but a lot of this may just be because I'm not seeing them. Regardless, I see the constant rebalancing and the RNG components of Outlaw as skeptical, something that I worry about for Rogue's place in competitive content in general, but also, you know, how much stronger it has the potential to be. They do still have incredible AoE potential because of this as Outlaw, and the other specs still have their old niches as talked about in the previous video. They do have good mobility and survivability, and this can be especially strong and skittish. Really, if anything, I would say that they are one of the strongest skittish DPS. Utility had a chance to be a home run here, especially in the recent patch, but I've yet to see a single place for Shroud of Concealment. You see, it was reintroduced recently, so if you guys know of a great place for its usage, let me know in the comments. There always used to be great places in MOP and WOD CMs for Shroud of Concealment, but now I just don't see any rogues, and I never hear anyone talking about it, so I hope to hear that I'm wrong on this topic. Number 11 overall, tier 4. Number 2 is Shaman. Enhance has fallen over the months. Let's be clear here. In the beta, Enhance was easily one of the strongest 5-man DPSers ever conceived, and they've just taken hit after hit after hit for 5-mans. It's really leaving them in a poor place. My thoughts on Ellie continue to be favorable for dungeons, but their utility becomes less and less important the more gear we get and the harder dungeons we do, unfortunately. Regardless, both specs do still have strong burst potential and overall good DPS, especially on a single target. They do both have a very wide kit of utility, but unfortunately a lot of it is overlapped by stronger class options having the same thing. They have the AoE stun that all these years later still manages to get used terribly or misses targets entirely. The amount of times I've seen shamans drop it on the pole with a Windwalker monk or another damage dealing stun is just absolutely insane. They both overlap, or just they throw it in a place and the mobs move away from it and it only gets like 1 out of the 3 or 4 mobs. It's just absolutely insane. They also have Bloodlust, which is invaluable if your group doesn't already have one, but if you have a mage, then the shaman does not need to use Bloodlust ever anymore now that you can't reset lust. And Ankh can still be used in very clever ways to skip trash. We talked a little bit about this with Warlocks, but there are some things that I like to do a controlled wipe on for dungeons, but nobody ever wants to do it because if any one person messes it up, that's it. He's pretty much lost, and less people want to risk that, obviously, so it can still act as a self-res if you die, so it has some value. Now, Elemental still has the knockdown on Earthquake, which reduces damage taken and interrupt casts of anything that it hits, obviously. This can be very useful for packs like the Knife Throwers and Black Hold and the Imps in Court. It's similar to Solar Beam, but less reliable than Solar Beam and kind of just outpaced by Trents. At one point, I considered it to be the de facto way to reduce damage on the tank, but the harder we do the 5-man's at and the more gear we get, it seems like tanks really just don't need any help, so it's not as useful as it used to be. And they also still have some incredibly strong off-healing potential with AG plus their overload burst as elemental. But once again, the harder dungeons require a healing number that is either completely irrelevant, easily healed by the healer, or too much for this spell to make a big difference. You're very likely never needing a second healer in these dungeons is what I'm trying to say. It was ideal for packs like the 5 pull starting in Iron Docks back in WOD and obviously in MOP as well, but Mythic Plus rarely has opportunities for that type of pulling and progression difficulty, especially with some of the affixes. Number 12 overall, tier 3. Number 3 is the Rat Paladin. Let's get this straight. They have very explosive AoE and pretty strong single target as well in dungeons. They do have average mobility, but the best durability of all melee. Like Bombkin, they have some incredibly strong utility, but ultimately it has no real use in 5-man. And where it does, it can even be more useful on the healer or tank slot of paladins as well. They have a natural stun for undead, which can be useful in Black Hold, etc., but it needs to be used as a DPS CD, and this often causes it to just DR heavily with other real stuns. Overall, I look at Ret as a great damage dealer, but lacking any meaningful tool to consider them strong. Especially as Paladin is my main spec, I find Holy and Prot to be able to put out insane value for their roles, and still bring anything a Ret Paladin would consider useful for most situations. There's really nothing wrong with a Ret Paladin. I wouldn't say that they're unplayable, and I want to make that perfectly clear. Between them and the last slot here, there's absolutely no reason you cannot bring them, but simply they don't bring anything that any other damage dealer can't as well, and there's nothing unique about them. And finally, number 0 billionth overall is Feral Druid. Druid. Unfortunately, this is an easy choice for me. They are quite bad in 5-mans. Definitely in a world where we have almost ideal balance, the Feral Druid is really struggling. They do have very good single target, and hopefully I'll have some footage for you guys of good Feral Druid play, but their AoE requires a great sacrifice, apparently, in terms of talents. I don't actually know, but all I hear about is how people say if you're going AoE spec, you're taking a lot of damage away from their single target, so that's never a good thing. They are definitely the second most durable as well. This can be incredibly useful for skittish and necrotic weeks. They can literally tank trash almost as well as a regular tank. The amount of times we've had our druid grab some mobs off the tank when he's dying, or if he dies, or if he needs to reset some skittish or necrotic issues, then we can do that easily. And unfortunately, their utility is just nothing compared to Bombkin. This is why I split them up, because Bombkin is just in a different class, and they should not be compared on the same line with Feral. But they do still have a weaker version of Stampeding Roar, which obviously can be useful, and a Battle Res, which is more than Rhett really has, so they're simply just too clunky for 5-mans in my opinion, especially when compared to Bombkin, which is ranged and brings an incredibly valuable kit. There's nothing wrong with Feral damage, don't get me wrong, but just like Rhett, they don't offer any compelling reason to bring them over any other class or spec in the game, and do less AoE damage just naturally than any other thing on this list. So that's the list. What'd you think? If you made it this far, bravo. You've done better than most. You were very patient, and once again, I ask for your patience when you're about to leave a comment. If you watched the whole video, you probably heard something you didn't like. Maybe it's about your favorite spec, or a spec that you think I just misrepresented. If you feel that way, I would very much appreciate some professionalism. Instead of just shitting on my video or insulting me as an individual, why not give me a detailed reason why I was wrong? Especially about the lower 8 or so specs and classes, I would happily hear some advice from how these places could be better. The thing is, the first 8 just seem like slam dunks to me. There's some really hard confusion and difficulty with the rogue and shaman spots, but otherwise I really don't look at this list this time around as anything that could move. But you never know, just like last time, I probably would have said the same thing. So anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next list, which will most likely be the tanking one, and then the healing one will come after that.